Hi kids, so now let us discuss about metabolism, and this is the second topic for your final period. Now our discussion will be divided into 6. So first we will be talking about some terminologies, so that will be your introduction, then your metabolic intermediate compounds, then we have your catabolism, and then your glycolysis, your Cori cycle, and then last is your citric acid cycle. But for your citric acid cycle, that will be in a separate video. So we will end with your Cori cycle and as to the end product of your glycolysis. So these are our objectives, and we will start with introduction. So what exactly is metabolism? So when we say metabolism, kids, this is referring to all biochemical processes in our body that maintains life, because metabolism is in terms of the production and the use of our energy. So as stated here, it is the sum total of all the chemical reactions involved in maintaining the dynamic state of our cells. And the image that you see here are just some of the biochemical reactions that is happening in our body. And these are actually your major pathways, from your glycolysis to your citric acid cycle and to your oxidative phosphorylation, which involves your electron transport chain. So there are actually two types of metabolic reaction. It could either be catabolism or your anabolism. So just by looking at this image, kids, you will already get a better picture as to what these two reactions are. So when we say catabolism, kids, this releases energy. Every time we try to break down your larger molecules into smaller molecules, a release of energy happens. And for your anabolism, it is the other way around. So when we say anabolism, this will use energy because we are trying to bind smaller molecules in order to create a larger one. So as defined here in your slide, catabolism are those in which molecules are broken down to provide energy, while anabolism are those that are synthesized in order to create a bigger compound and energy is being used. Now, there are two types of metabolic pathway. We have your linear and we have your cyclic metabolic pathway. So whenever we talk about or we mention the word pathway, this is referring to consecutive biochemical reactions that involves your enzyme, because enzyme will always be responsible in catalyzing each reaction in your pathway, because we are talking about converting one substrate to become a new substance or to have a new product. So for your linear metabolic pathway, we will be able to get a final product, while your cyclic metabolic pathway refers to a series of reaction in which it is continuous, and whatever the product that is formed in your cyclic metabolic pathway, it will just then be reused and then continuous na cycle. So again, these are the metabolic pathways that we will be discussing as of this moment. So we will start with your common catabolic pathway, then we will proceed with your glycolysis, then your citric acid cycle, and then last would be your oxidative phosphorylation, to which under is your electron transport chain. So let me just point out here, kids, that these metabolic pathways are continuous. Hindi po tayo pwede mag-skip ng one pathway to the other. So, di po tayo pwede mag-start ng citric acid cycle agad-agad without the glycolysis. So, it will always begin with your common catabolic pathway, proceeded by your glycolysis, then your citric, and then ito yung last natin. So, before we will actually discuss your pathways, we need to know first the presence of your intermediate compounds and as to what are their different roles, because these intermediate compounds play a very important role in terms of the reactions catalyzed in each step of your pathway, and that you'd get to encounter them in almost every enzymatic reaction. So these are our intermediate compounds, and they are classified into three in terms of their function. So our first classification are those intermediates for your storage of energy and for the transfer of your phosphate group. The second one is for your redox reaction. And the third one is for the transfer of your acetyl group. So let's begin with our first classification. So for the storage of energy and transfer of your phosphate groups, we have three intermediates that only differ in terms of the number of phosphate that is present in their structure. So that would be your ATP, your ADP, and your AMP. So in terms of the names, ayan po sa baba. So AMP means adenosine monophosphate, ADP diphosphate, ATP triphosphate. So dun pa lang sa name nila, you will already get an idea. So how many phosphate is present in their structure? Monophosphate, mono, isa. Diphosphate, di, so dalawa. Triphosphate, tatlo. Now, in the backbone structure of these intermediate compounds, so still present yung ating nucleotide. Andun yung adenine nyo, andun yung ribose, to which we collectively call them as your adenosine. So that is why the very first name of all of these intermediates are adenosine. So to give you an example as to the function of these intermediate compounds, so this is referring to how they facilitate transfer of phosphate group. Now, syempre, being a molecule that contains different number of phosphate, then they are able to donate a phosphate group in order to add it to our substrate. So this is actually the very first enzymatic reaction that is happening in your glycolysis, wherein we need to convert glucose to your glucose 6-phosphate. So here, looking at the highlighted portions, that is where the reaction is taking place. So we are trying to remove hydrogen here in your 6-carbon, replacing it with your phosphate. Then again, we got phosphate from your ATP. Thus, ATP maminusan na po ng isang phosphate, becoming ADP. And the enzyme that will catalyze this reaction is your hexokinase. So how about our second classification? So what involves in the redox reaction of your different enzymatic reaction would be your FAD and your NAD. So again, FAD stands for your flavine adenine dinucleotide, while NAD stands for your nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. So in this table, this is just to explain once again what happens during redox reaction when there is oxidation and when there is reduction. So just a review, if it is oxidation, then there is loss of electrons and there is loss of hydrogen and there is a gain of oxygen, while reduction is the other way around, it's the opposite. So here in your reduction, there is gain of electron and hydrogen and there is loss of oxygen. So that is what we will be observing in your different enzymatic reaction when redox reaction is the process that is taking place. And just remember that redox reaction, your oxidation reduction will always be in pair. Now, kumbaga, hindi pwede na oxidation lang, hindi pwede na reduction lang. They will always come in pair. Parang ganun yung thought. So let us take a look at the structure of your FAD. FAD is in your oxidized form, FADH2 kung na-reduce na siya. And in the structure of your FAD, andun pa rin po yung ating adenosine, but what is added in your adenosine is your riboflavin. So this is your ribitol na portion bound to your second phosphate group and your flavin. So they are collectively called as your riboflavin, and riboflavin is your vitamin B2. So this is an example of the enzymatic reaction that is wherein your FAD is present. And as you can see here, FAD to FADH2, so meaning dito yung reduction nangyayari. So at which area or portion yung oxidation? So dito po sa ating substrate. So looking at the structure of your succinate, supposed to be in totality may 4 siya dito na hydrogen. So we will remove 2, and then yung pag-remove kids, transforming it now to carbon double bond, and yung mag-receive nung na-oxidized or na-removed na dalawang hydrogen would be your FAD, thus naging reduced form. How about your NAD? So NAD, if it is in its oxidized form, NADH plus H plus if in its reduced form. So andun pa rin yung ating adenosine. And this time, what we added in this structure, nakakabit pa rin po dun sa ating second phosphate would be your ribose, another ribose, and your nicotinamide. What will provide your nicotinamide, kids, would be your vitamin B3, which is your niacin. So, vitamin B2 kanina for your FAD, vitamin B3 here in your NAD. And sometimes, your NAD can also become NADPH or NADP, lalo na if dito na portion sa second na carbon nyo is may phosphate na ma-add. So, we call it your nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. So, this is the reaction that your NAD would catalyze. So, an example is in terms of the conversion of your ethanol to ethanol. And the enzyme that will catalyze this reaction is your alcohol dehydrogenase. So, here, oxidation happens in your ethanol, wherein we removed 2 hydrogen molecules. 1 hydrogen will be received by your NAD, forming its reduced na form, which is your NADH, and then the other hydrogen ion, ito yung nakakabit. And then now we have your ethanol. So, for the last classification of your intermediate compound, so there we have your coenzyme A. Now, your coenzyme A, ito, coenzyme A, this is its shortcut na chemical na form, or this is how you write down coenzyme A if gusto nyo siya i-shortcut. And itong HS or itong SH na nakikita nyo, kids, this is referring to this portion of the structure of your coenzyme A. So as you can see, this is your adenosine pa rin, but instead of the usual adenosine, the third carbon here in your ribose is phosphorylated, so that is why it is emphasized here as phosphorylated ADP. So in the second carbon, nakakabit yung pantothenic acid nyo and your 2-amino ethane thiol. Now take note that your pantothenic acid is also known as your vitamin B5. So in short, very important ang presence ng vitamin B complex natin, kids, in the formation of your intermediate compounds. Now, remember thiol group? Every time you get to encounter the word thiol, this is referring to the presence of your sulfur. So here, what will happen is that your coenzyme A will be the one to bind to your acetyl group, forming now your acetyl coenzyme A, which is a very important molecule in order to start your citric acid cycle. So you'll get to know more about that once we reach your citric acid cycle and the end of your glycolysis. So we will proceed first with catabolism. So your catabolism, kids, is actually divided into 4 different stages. Stage 1 is referring to your digestion process. Stage 2, we call it your acetyl group formation. Stage 3 is your citric acid cycle. And stage 4 would be your electron transport chain and your oxidative phosphorylation. So here in the digestion process, what happens here, diba, is that we are trying to break down larger molecules into simpler ones. Simpler or smaller ones. So for example, your polysaccharides will be broken down into monosaccharides. So muna siya, carbohydrates to monosaccharides. Your proteins will be broken down into your amino acid. Remember that amino acids is a combination of a lot of, your proteins rather, is a combination of a lot of amino acids bound together to form one polypeptide chain. And then in terms of your fat, it will be broken down, releasing your fatty acids and releasing your glycerol. So basically in this level, kids, sila glucose, sila amino acids, so these are your monomers. So by the time we already get these substances, all of this will be converted to acetyl coenzyme A. Again, mapa si glucose, mapa si glycerol, mapa amino acids, it will involve certain enzymatic reaction until such time that it will become your acetyl coenzyme A. So thus, your stage 2 is called as your acetyl group formation. They need to be converted to acetyl coenzyme A because the primary requirement for your citric acid cycle to start is, of course, your acetyl coenzyme A. So just to further discuss as to what is exactly happening in your stage 2, which is your acetyl group formation, so as stated here, your sugar will enter into your glycolysis pathway, and then the end product of your glycolysis, which is your pyruvate, will be converted to acetyl coenzyme A participating in your citric acid cycle. In terms of your amino group, where we got it from your amino acids, so remember that your amino acids na atay duha ka portion, di ba? Duha ka portion sa amino acid. So you have your N-terminal referring to your amino group and your C-terminal referring to your carboxyl group. So the remaining carbon skeleton will enter in the catabolic processes at many steps and then participate again in your citric acid cycle. Next, your fatty acid, they are converted directly to acetyl coenzyme A, enter your citric acid cycle, and with glycerol, which is produced by the hydrolysis of your fat, it will be converted to your glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is an intermediate of your glycolysis. Then again, at the end of your glycolysis, mako-convert pa rin po to acetyl coenzyme A and participate in your citric acid cycle. So, yun yung main point talaga ng stage 2 nyo kids. Formation of your acetyl coenzyme A in order to participate in your citric acid cycle. So, in this table, this summarizes the requirement and the result of those 4 stages that we have mentioned. And this is referring or specifically pointing out to how your carbohydrates are catabolized. So again, digestion, the requirement are your macromolecules or your polysaccharides. Further, breakdown nato ang inyuhang mga monomer, mga macromolecules ug inyuhang mga polysaccharide, and the result would be your monomers. And then in your glycolysis, our requirement are your monosaccharides, specifically your glucose, wherein the result will be your pyruvate, which will eventually be converted to acetyl coenzyme A. Stage 3 is your citric acid cycle. Requirement is your acetyl coenzyme A. Our result here or products would be your NADH and FADH2, which are our intermediate compounds, and including your GTP, which is just another form of energy. And then the last one would be your oxidative phosphorylation and your electron transport chain, wherein the requirement are your intermediate products na sila NADH and FADH, and the result is, of course, energy production. So what do you notice here in your carbohydrate catabolism? Diba? One thing to point out here, kids, whatever the result, it will be used as the requirement of the next na stage. So that is why, as I have mentioned a while ago, these processes, these stages are continuous. Dili pwede ta mag-skip and dili pud ta pwede na mag-start sa different na stages. It will always begin with your digestion process and it will always end with your electron transport chain. So now let us discuss how digestion of your carbohydrates exactly happen. So of course, let me point out that all of the organs in our body will really have a role in terms of the digestion of the food that we eat. Diba? Even your liver, even your pancreas, even your salivary glands or your pharynx, lahat-lahat yan sila may mga roles and it will help in your digestion. But let us focus on the schematic diagram here, because this will summarize how digestion process will happen, and it will only involve 3 different organs, from the mouth to your stomach and to your small intestine. Now, of course, in the mouth, dara man gyud ta mag-intake of food, and the food that we eat are still composed of macromolecules. So from your polysaccharides, and it could be na naay presence lang sa mga disaccharides. But then again, the point here, larger molecules pa ang content ng food na ato ang gikaon. And what is present in the mouth is your salivary amylase, which will help in the hydrolysis of your glycosidic linkages or your glycosidic bonds. So, food now will pass through your stomach, and what is inside your stomach are your gastric juices. Now, it is pointed out here that your gastric juices does not have any effect on digestion. So let me just point out that your gastric juices, more on ang effect niya is in your proteins because gastric juices are responsible in the hydrolysis of your peptide bonds. Itong statement na no effect on digestion, this is referring specifically to your carbohydrate na wala po siyang effect sa carbohydrate nyo and thus the polysaccharides will just then directly go to your small intestine na ganun pa rin po yung form. And what is present in your small intestine are your digestive enzymes. So with the presence of your digestive enzymes, your polysaccharides will be hydrolyzed to become your disaccharides. And remember our three main disaccharides, your maltose, your sucrose, and your lactose. So these disaccharides will then go to the intestinal mucosal cells wherein further hydrolysis will happen. And now we will have your monosaccharides, your glucose, your fructose, and your galactose. And by the time we already have your monosaccharides, we will now be able to absorb it into our body. And these three monosaccharides will pass through, will go inside your intestinal lining via active transport, and will then be released into our circulation to be used up as energy. So, yun yung whole digestion process natin. Yan na yung summary. So, by the time we already have your monosaccharides, glycolysis process will now begin. So, before we discuss the pathway, let us discuss first just a short background as to what glycolysis exactly is. So, glycolysis is also known as your Embden-Meyerhof pathway. And it is a biochemical reaction that involves a lot of enzymes and will begin with your glucose. So that is why glucose is considered to be our major source of energy because here in your glycolysis, siya po talaga yung ating ginagamit. Now, glycolysis is an aerobic na process, meaning it does not need the presence of oxygen. Without oxygen, it can still proceed. In that your glycolysis happens in your cytoplasm. So your glycolysis pathway is summarized into 10 steps and there are 3 major products here, your ATP, your NADH, and 2,3-carbon pyruvate. So as to why dalawa yung pyruvate, so you get to know that as we go along our discussion. So this is our 10 steps, starting from your glucose and ending with the presence of your pyruvate. So isa-isa ho nato ni siya og discuss, kids, and let me just point out that again, you do not need to remember what exact processes are happening in each step. All you have to do is just to remember this pathway. Ano yung substrate, ano yung enzyme, ano yung product, and then sunod-sunod na. Now, in your handout, I placed mnemonics there for you at least na para makatabang sa inyo ha ug memorize. This mnemonics is for your substrate and that is your goodness gracious, Father Franklin did go by picking pumpkin to prepare pies. So the first letters of each of these na mga words is referring to your substrates. We also have mnemonics for your enzymes, and that is high-profile people, act glamorous, picture posing every place. So that depends on you whether to make use of your mnemonics. Basta again, the challenge here is to really memorize your pathway. So, glycolysis is actually divided into 2 stages. Steps 1 and 3 is a 6-carbon stage, while ito, steps 4 to 10 nyo is a 3-carbon stage. So why is it called as a 6-carbon stage or a 3-carbon stage? Looking at the different steps here, as you can see, skim ko lang, diba? It involves a 6-carbon na mga substances. So that is why 6-carbon stage siya. But by the time we will already begin with your step 4, 3 carbon na lang po siya, kids. So kaya lahat-lahat sila kung makikita nyo, it involves all of your substances contains only 3 carbons in their structure. So let us begin with your step 1, with your first stage. Now again, your 6-carbon stage is an energy-consuming stage. Looking at your first step, kaya siya energy-consuming because again, we are still using up your energy, we are still using up your ATPs. So phosphorylation meaning we are adding a phosphate group to your substrate. So I actually explained this one. Yan, ito po yung example natin kanina to emphasize the action of your ATP. So again, glucose will become your glucose 6-phosphate and the enzyme that will catalyze this reaction would be your hexokinase. And then next would be isomerization. So isomerization means there is rearrangement of your molecules. And what did we rearrange here in your glucose 6-phosphate? So that would be in terms of your first carbon. So what we did here is that we released, gigawas na to ang inyuhang first na carbon na dili na siya part sa inyuhang ring, thus forming your fructose 6-phosphate. So this time, dili na siya 6-sided na ring, kung dili 5-sided na ring na lang siya. And the enzyme here is your phosphoglucoisomerase. So the last step in your 6-carbon stage would be another phosphorylation. So meaning to say we are using again energy na i-add na phosphate na group na pod sa atuang substrate. And at which portion did we add a phosphate group? So in the first carbon, we removed a hydrogen, replacing it now with your phosphate group. And actually, the name of your structure is actually referring to the position of your phosphate. Diba? Fructose 1,6, first carbon, and 6 na carbon, bi or bisphosphate because there is presence of 2 phosphate group. And the enzyme that will catalyze this reaction is your phosphofructokinase. So now let us proceed to our second stage, and that is your 3-carbon stage. And the very first thing that will happen here, in order na mag-transform yung 6-carbon natin to 3 would be cleavage. So when we say cleavage, there is splitting up. We are dividing your fructose 1,6-bisphosphate into 2 different molecules, and exactly natigtulo-tulo sila, and we will get 2 different substances here. So we will have your dihydroxyacetone phosphate and we will have your glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Now, this reaction will be catalyzed by your aldolase. Now, before proceeding to another enzymatic step, let me point out that your glyceraldehyde 3 will only be the substance that can proceed in your glycolysis. So therefore, para di po masayang yung ating dihydroxyacetone, we will also transform this one to become your glyceraldehyde. And so our next step is isomerization. So we will just transform dihydroxyacetone to become your glyceraldehyde, rearranging itong carbon double bond oxygen nyo, placing it here in your first na carbon. So, in the next steps, kids, starting from the formation of your dihydroxy to glyceraldehyde, all of this now are into molecules. Kasi nga, di ba, here in our cleavage, in the cleavage of your fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, na natay isa ka glyceraldehyde daan. Now, remember that dihydroxyacetone is also transformed to become your glyceraldehyde. So, lahat-lahat from here pababa, they are already into molecules. So, dili man pasabot na mamili lang tawag isa, both your glyceraldehyde, yung dalawang glyceraldehyde ninyo, will be used until such time that you will be able to get your product. So, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate will undergo oxidation and phosphorylation. So, andito na po yung NAD nyo, kids. And as you can see, redox reaction will take place. Oxidize the kay glyceraldehyde, removing the hydrogen portion here, releasing it into your circulation, and then it will be replaced by your phosphate group. So, we now have your 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate catalyzed by your glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. And then the next step would be phosphorylation. So, try to look at, kids. Hindi na po tayo nag-phosphorylate sa substrate nyo, but what we phosphorylate here is your ADP, forming now your ATP. Thus, your 3-carbon stage is called as energy production na stage because we are now producing ATPs here. So, remove po tayo sa phosphate group dito sa first na carbon ng substrate nyo. I-add siya dun sa ADP, kaya naging ATP na. And our product here is your 3-phosphoglycerate. And then on the next step is another isomerization, wherein what we rearranged here is just the position of your phosphate. So originally, phosphate is here in your 3rd carbon. So we will transfer it to your 2nd carbon, replacing the OH. So si OH na naman yung andun kay 3rd carbon nyo. So now we have your 2-phosphoglycerate. Second to the last step would be dehydration. So meaning we are removing a water molecule from your 2-phosphoglycerate, and dito po siya na portion. So upon the removal of your H2O, yung carbon to carbon nyo po dito magdo-double bond na, and we now call it your phosphoenol pyruvate. And the enzyme that will catalyze this reaction would be your enolase. And then the last step in your glycolysis would be another phosphorylation. So ayun, ADP to ATP na naman, meaning may na-produce na naman po tayo na energy, and the phosphate comes from here sa 2nd carbon nyo, leaving now your carbon to double bond O. So that ends your glycolysis na pathway, kids. So again, starting from here sa glyceraldehyde until na we will get your pyruvate, 2 molecules na siya. So that is actually the reason why yung dun sa pag-define natin kay glycolysis, naka-emphasize na 2 molecules talaga siya. So, what we need to know next is, ilan ba talaga ang lahat-lahat ng ATPs na na-produce? Now, the reaction that you see here is the overall equation referring to your intermediate compounds and to your energy production and to your end product. So, parang shortcut ito, kids, na referring to your starting and to your product and all those substances involved in order to get your pyruvate. So, we will focus now on the table below for us to know how many ATPs were created in glycolysis alone. So, remember that in your first stage, which involves your step 1 and 3, diba, energy consumption. So, that is why -1 ito, kids, kasi gumamit pa tayo ng ATP. But in your second stage, that is energy production, and energy production is evident in your step 7 and step 10. Now, bakit siya naka +2? Because again, starting in step 7 and 10, sila yung ×2 na yung molecules nyo. So, that is why +2 na siya. So, of course, 4 - 2, so our net ATP here in glycolysis alone is 2. So, para mas ma-picture out nyo lang po, let me just zoom it in. So, ayan po for steps 1 and 3. Diba? Nakikita nyo po na energy consumption. Ito po for your step 7 and step 10. So, ayan, phosphorylation ni ADP para may ma-produce po tayo na energy. So, yan yung summary. Ito po yung steps na na-point out dito sa summary ng ating ATP, kung ilang ATP yung nagamit and na-produce during glycolysis. So the next question, kids, where would your galactose and fructose enter into your glycolysis? Remember, hindi lang naman po si glucose yung ating monosaccharide. We can also obtain galactose and fructose from the food that we eat. So, where will your galactose and fructose enter? Siyempre, dili pwede na i-remove lang nato siya. They can still participate in your glycolysis in this portion. So, unahon nato si galactose. Now, the 4 steps that you see here is referring to 4 different enzymatic steps until such time that your galactose will become your glucose 1-phosphate. Then again, wala na siya naka-emphasize and wala na po siya gi-point out sa reference book ninyo. So, just remember that your galactose will participate in your glycolysis by the time it will become your glucose 6-phosphate, which is a part in the step 1 of your glycolysis. As to your fructose, kids, dito siya sa second stage nyo sa glycolysis mag-enter. So, fructose will be converted to your fructose 1-phosphate, and there are two things that can happen to your fructose participation. Pwede siya ma-convert to become your dihydroxyacetone phosphate, or pwede siya i-convert further to glyceraldehyde until magiging na siyang si glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So, yun yung participation ni galactose and fructose nyo. So, going back to our end product, which is your pyruvate, there are 3 common fates of pyruvate depending on what is needed in our body. Pyruvate can be converted into 3 different substances. It could become acetyl coenzyme A, it could become lactate, and it could become your ethanol. So, the first thing that I would like to point out is in terms of the condition needed in order for your pyruvate to be converted into these different substances. And as you can see, yung naiiba lang po dito is pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A, in which ang kailangan po natin is aerobic na condition. So when we say aerobic condition, kids, this is referring to the presence of oxygen. And this is what happens for your pyruvate to be converted to acetyl. Again, acetyl coenzyme A is the most important substance here because this is the beginning of your citric acid cycle. Siya yung ating primary requirement. So, dito po ma-observe yung function ng ating third intermediate compound na si coenzyme A. Ayan, si coenzyme A. So, what is happening here, kids, is actually decarboxylation, removing of your carbon dioxide, and redox reaction. So, kaya may nakikita naman po kayong NAD. So, remove tayo ng carbon dioxide. Kaya, kung makikita nyo po dito sa ating product, ayan na yung CO2. So, ang naiwan, kids, ito na portion ng pyruvate nyo, that is your acetyl group. Acetyl group will bind to your coenzyme A by the removal of hydrogen, adding it to your NAD, kaya naging NADH, kaya ayan na yung acetyl coenzyme A nyo. And the enzyme that will catalyze this reaction would be your pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. Now, how about pyruvate to lactate? Now, what will catalyze the conversion of this is your lactate dehydrogenase, and redox reaction pa rin po yung nangyayari dito sa ating pyruvate to lactate na conversion. Now, let me point out, kids, that the conversion of pyruvate to lactate is also an important process when there is oxygen deprivation. Again, your citric acid cycle needs oxygen. Kaya nga, yung acetyl coenzyme A nyo, aerobic na condition kasi by the time mag-start na tayo kay citric acid cycle, it needs presence of your oxygen to start. Now, there are cases na deprive tayo ng oxygen, correct? And an example for that would be during strenuous exercises or may mga ginagawa tayo na kailangan talaga ng too much energy. And, di ba, exercise man yun ang number 1 na possible na magkaroon ta og oxygen deprivation. Now, in that case, when there is oxygen deprivation, your citric acid cycle will not begin, so therefore, there will be no energy production. Now, syempre, bawal na walang energy production. What will happen to your cells? What will happen to our body? Without energy, without ATPs, our cells will die. Then, of course, eventually, we will also die. So, para may continued na ATP production tayo, pyruvate will then be converted to lactate. And then, this reaction will produce 2 moles of ATP. And actually, kids, that is very low. If we will add all of the ATPs that will be produced from your glycolysis until mag-end tayo kay electron transport chain, the energy that is produced there will total to about 36 to 38. And compare it to the 2 moles ATP produced by your lactate. So therefore, kailangan makorek agad-agad yung oxygen deprivation kasi other than very low ang ATP, very low ang energy production, the other problem that we will face is in terms of the accumulation of your lactate, which will cause our pH to go down, making it acidic. And that is what we call your lactic acidosis. Kanang lactic acidosis, kids, that will also have a grave effect into our muscle kasi may tinatawag po tayong Cori cycle. This Cori cycle refers to the conversion of your pyruvate to lactate that is exactly happening in the muscles. So cycle in such a way that your glucose will be converted to pyruvate to lactate, and by the time na naanay lactate, release sa circulation, i-deliver kay liver, and will undergo gluconeogenesis for your lactate to be converted back to glucose. So you get to know more about this gluconeogenesis sa separate na discussion. So, yung lactic acidosis na sinasabi po natin, kids, this is evident once you feel that your muscles are karaganing kapoy, hawoy, nag-muscle cramps na mo. So, those are indications that there is already accumulation of your lactate. So, kaya nga, again, kailangan makorek because it is harmful in our body. So, next, we have the conversion of your pyruvate to ethanol. And let me just point out, kids, there is no conversion of pyruvate to ethanol in humans. This happens in microorganisms. And this is what we call your ethanol fermentation. Now, ethanol fermentation is best example for ethanol fermentation, kids, would be involving your yeast that will cause your bread, diba? That will cause your bread to rise. So, mo na siya actually ang effect na nga numutubo ang pan. That is because of the conversion of pyruvate to ethanol. And it actually involves two different steps. Pyruvate to acetaldehyde. Enzyme is your pyruvate decarboxylase. Acetaldehyde convert to ethanol, and that is catalyzed by your enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase. So, as mentioned, yung pinaka-important po talaga is the conversion of your pyruvate to your acetyl coenzyme A. And take note, the conversion of your pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A happens inside your mitochondria. And mitochondria needs oxygen in order to function. So the one that you see here, ito po na enzymatic reaction, it is the same enzymatic reaction that I have explained a while ago. So by the time we already have your acetyl coenzyme A, it will now begin, your citric acid cycle will now begin. So that is why stage 2 is considered to be your acetyl group formation catalyzed by your glycolysis. And then stage 3, kailangan naman tayo acetyl coenzyme A, so mauna na siya ang atuang starting kay citric acid cycle. So kindly watch the next video which will focus on the discussion of your citric acid cycle. So thank you so much for listening, kids, and I hope that you understood well our discussion.